Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my mid-year classics wrap-up. So we are going to be talking about all of the classics that I have read thus far in 2021. I did this last year and the year before. I kind of did a yearly classics wrap up and you guys really seem to enjoy it. So last year and this year as well, I feel like I've read quite a few classics in the first half of the year, so it makes sense to me to break it up here at the halfway point. I am definitely leaving out things that I DNF'd, and I'm also leaving out some things that I don't really track, like poetry. Let's just get right into this because I think we'll probably be here a while. So the first classic that I read in 2021 was A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, and I listened to this on audiobook, and I really think it was the best choice. I think it was a really well done audiobook, and it's a very short book, and I actually have to say, looking at the list of classics that I've read this year, short fiction has been a bit of a theme, which is very unintentional for me. I normally try to target longer books on my TBR, and I very rarely pay attention to shorter books because I actually kind of struggle with that. I really struggle with a shorter novel or a novella or a short story. I often wonder, why don't you just make it a book? Because I very rarely get invested in shorter fiction like that. A Room with a View is actually one of the short classics that I've read thus far this year that has actually proved to me that I can really enjoy short fiction, because this is one that once I finished it, I said that was okay. That's a 3-star read, but it is one that I have found myself pretty frequently thinking about in the months since finishing it. And so I really loved this. I think this is a very lighthearted, charming story, and I think that it works very well for this time of year. I think it is a very good summer book. It feels very sunshiny. Now, it is set in Florence. It's an Edwardian classic, so written in the early 1900s, and it is set for the most part in Florence, Italy, and that's the large majority of its charm to me. I did really like the male love interest, and I just found the love story a bit charming. I found everything about this book to be very charming. So this is one that has quite unintentionally stuck with me. Next up, I read The Civil War by Lucan, or Pharsalia. It is sometimes called Pharsalia. And this is an ancient classic of ancient Rome. And so this is actually an epic poem that surrounds the civil war of Caesar and Pompey. And it is so good. So many people hate this, and I get the sense that a lot of classicists hate it. But I feel like maybe if you studied this and you read it alongside the Aeneid, you read it alongside Ovid, you read it alongside Petronius, and just a whole bunch of other people that were really living at the same time as Lucan, I feel like you probably would say this does fall against some of the more famous epic poetry of the ancient world. But I was really charmed by this. It is structured extremely oddly. Some of the lines don't make sense. Some of them don't fit into meter, and you're not quite sure whether that was Lucan's intention or not. But this was written when Lucan was extremely young. He also died very young, but this was written when he was in his mid-20s, I think, early to mid-20s, and it was one of the first things he did, if I'm remembering correctly, and it just stuns me. There's a lot of really beautiful language here, and there's a lot of really wonderful setting up of future events, a lot of great foreshadowing for what is to come, particularly with Caesar. And so it's just a really fascinating work because it is one that you can read on many different levels. This can go for many different ancient classics, but Lucan's Civil War, you know, it's epic poetry, it is a retelling of Caesar's civil war, but it's also a commentary on what was going on in Lucan's day with Nero. And so I just found this to be really fascinating, and I'm really not quite sure why people hate it. I see on a structural level, it sometimes doesn't make sense if you read a lot of poetry, if you read a lot of epic poetry in particular. There are parts of it that you get the sense didn't translate very well, or just plain didn't make sense even in Latin. This is one of my favorite pieces of epic poetry. I'm a bit of a sucker for epic poetry. I like almost everything I've read that can be considered epic poetry, but this is one that I've always been fairly partial to, and it was a reread for me. So I really loved this, and I rated it 4 stars. I apparently read The Jewel of the Seven Stars by Bram Stoker this year. I have zero memory of this book. I really don't even remember consciously deciding to pick it up. I honestly have zero memory of it. I don't really even remember what it was about. Sitting here and saying the name, it does make me think that it was Egyptian based, which I think is probably why I was interested in it. I think it was about a mummy, if I'm not mistaken, and it fell really rather short for me. According to my review on Goodreads, I gave it a generous 2 stars because there were parts of it that apparently did not make sense to me when I was reading it, but I listened to this on audiobook. And I'm always curious if, when I read something on audiobook, if I really enjoyed it, because I do sometimes struggle with certain audiobook narrators, and I wonder if that affected my experience here. I don't think it did. I have struggled with Bram Stoker in the past, so it doesn't shock me that I rated this 2 stars. It just shocks me that I read it this year and I apparently don't remember anything about it. So it was apparently not a very memorable read. In March, I picked up the Pickwick Papers for the Dickens versus Tolstoy read-along hosted by Emmy and Carolyn Marie Reads, and I am so glad I did. This was an absolute delight to me. This book was so much fun, and it never once felt as big as it actually is. It's over 700 pages, if I'm remembering correctly, but it never once felt that long to me. Now, there are parts of it that made me take it down a star. In my heart, I really wanted to give it 5 stars because I just really enjoyed it. And it's one of my favorite Charles Dickens books because one of the main plot points in this book is that the Pickwick Club, who this book centers around, they are very interested in recording stories. They are very interested in going around and meeting people and recording stories that other people have experienced or have told for generations. And so some of these chapters are ghost stories. Some of them are very heart-wrenching, horribly sad stories. Some of them are just really beautiful, fairy tale-like stories. One chapter in here very clearly sets up what will be A Christmas Carol. It follows exactly the same pattern, but instead of ghosts, it's with goblins. And it's so great. Everything about those kind of little vignettes really worked very well for me and is the reason why I enjoyed the Pickwick Papers so much. I could tell that those segments actually really bothered a lot of people in the book club, that they found them very tangential, and I can kind of agree with that, but for me, I was actually more engaged with those than with the main storyline. But this is a book that was serialized, so it came out kind of chapter by chapter, month by month, and it is a book where you see that. I don't often think you can tell when a book was serialized other than its size, but this is one where you can easily see, okay, they cut this for this issue. They left it on a cliffhanger so that you would buy the next issue, which I think is really interesting. So this one very clearly was a serialized book, and I could very easily tell that, but I really thoroughly enjoyed this. This is probably one of my highest recommends for the year in terms of classics. I just loved this. Very high 4 stars. Next, I picked up The Marble Fawn by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and wow, I mean, I have no words for this. This book was 5 stars, and it's very, very hard to recommend it because I recognize that so much about what worked for me with this is a very personal thing. The Marble Fawn has a very interesting plot going on. It's set in Rome in the 1800s, and it surrounds female artists, actually, and so it's a very, very interesting plot, but honestly, the plot is secondary to his absolutely gorgeous language. I want Nathaniel Hawthorne to take me around Rome anytime. It is so vivid. His language is so wonderful, and it really does feel as though you're there. It feels like he's saying, here you're looking at this, but he'll like tip your chin and say, look over here. It's a very personal book, and it feels like you are very much having a conversation with the author. The author is so present in this work, and I know that's a pet peeve for a lot of people, so this very well may not work well for a lot of people. But if you love the city of Rome, oh my gosh, read this. It's just so lush. It really does feel like you're there. He has a really interesting way of describing not only the monuments and kind of the layout of the city, that's really beautiful, but he also has a way of describing kind of the heat, the atmosphere of the city, how hot it gets there, kind of the season of sickness, the malaria season that was really famous back in the 1800s and prior. It was very, very dangerous to be in the city of Rome in the summer. And he will really describe things for you in such a way that it's so haunting. I mean, genuinely, this book is haunting. Often a character would be compared to something early on. So one of the main characters is compared to the Marble Fawn, which is a really famous sculpture that is there in Rome. And so throughout the book, he is described as a faun. He is described as being into kind of things like fawns would be, eating fruit, dancing around, frolicking. And then he's contrasted with a faun, and he's not quite as lighthearted as a faun. But the faun is always how he is described. Another character is described almost as a ghost. The entire time he runs with those metaphors, and it is just exquisite. I truly am blown away by this book. I cannot believe that somebody, a single mind, one man sat down and wrote this. I mean, this is just exquisite to me. I almost want to reread it. That's how good it was. It has stayed in the forefront of my mind since finishing it because it was just so evocative. It was so wonderfully written. And I just think it's very rare to read a book that makes you feel as though you are experiencing things alongside the characters. I very rarely am lost in books anymore. I know sometimes I'm reading a story or I'm, kind of watching the movie in my head, but I'm at a distance from it. It's very rarely that I feel totally lost in a book where I've lost track of time. But I lost track of time reading The Marble Fawn. I lost track of where I was. I totally believed I was there. I believed I was at the Roman catacombs. I believed I was at the Colosseum. And not only did I believe I was there, but I believed I was there in the summer, that the flowers were blooming, but they're kind of wilting because they haven't had rain in a while. It's very hot. I'm sweating. It's 85 degrees, and I need to kind of get in the shade of the Colosseum to really experience it. I mean, he really didn't leave anything to chance, anything to imagination. You were just so consumed in his vision of what Rome is. This was apparently an instant bestseller when it was originally published, and it became sort of a guidebook for Rome, and people would print off their pictures and stick between the pages of the book. There's actually a link between this book and the family photo album being created, and I see why. I mean, I really see why. I really want to read this when I go back to Rome and tuck my pictures between the pages because it was just such an experience. This is one, though, that definitely not everyone will like, so I do hesitate to recommend it, but it was a definite 5 stars from me. So the first that I read for this vlog was Candide by Voltaire, and I will willingly tell you this is one that I don't think I got. I really did not get on with this. I found it extremely repetitive. I found it very heavy-handed, and I do struggle with satire because of that, because I do often find it very, very heavy-handed, and that was certainly the case here. And I have been told by a lot of people prior to picking up Candide that I probably wouldn't like it, and that has held out. That was definitely the truth. I did not like this. In fact, it's kind of turned me off of Voltaire, sad to say. A lot of people have encouraged me to go to Voltaire's poetry. I didn't know he wrote poetry, but apparently he had an epic poem that Napoleon really enjoyed. And he also wrote drama, I believe. And so it's a shame to say that Candide has soured me on him just a bit. This was definitely a 2-star read, but it's another one that was very, very short, and thankfully so. I don't know that I could have taken much more of it, but this is one that I definitely didn't see the hype around. I understood what it was going for. I understood what it was trying to do. I just didn't really jive with it. And apparently Napoleon didn't really jive with it either. Napoleon had various opinions on Voltaire. I won't say that I wouldn't try him again. I definitely would, but I would never revisit Candide. I have read it once, and that was enough for me. The next that I read for that vlog was The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, and I had such mixed emotions about this one. This is very, very good, and it is also very, very upsetting to read. This deals with very heavy subject matter, and I think if you don't know that when you go into this, you're very, very shocked by the turns that the story takes. You're shocked by where it ends up. I do like the sense of melancholy about it. I found that to be probably the strongest aspect of the book because I was really invested in the tone, more so than any of the character dynamics. And it's just a really fascinating work. It is written in the form of letters, so it's an epistolary novel, but you only read the letters from Werther's point of view. You only read letters from one person. So you never get that response back, which makes it a fairly interesting work because you're constantly contemplating how other people are interacting with Werther, how other people feel about Werther. But this is just such a dark, heavy book, and it's not one you should read when you're feeling down. It is truly a very upsetting read to me, and so that is why I recommend that you read this when you're in a good mood, because it was so heavy. I mean, it really was, and I constantly found myself thinking about the ending. But I rated this 3 stars because I really wasn't quite sure what to rate it. I enjoyed parts of it. I didn't enjoy other parts, but this is definitely one that I still feel torn on. The last book that I picked up for that vlog was The Liberation of Jerusalem by Torquato Tasso. And you might can see I still have my bookmark in it because I'm still technically reading this. I didn't want to include books that I'm still currently reading in this list because I figured at the end of the year I could wrap up my whole feelings on them. But this is one that I intend to take a lot of time with. This is an epic poem that is set during the First Crusade, but it's an Italian classic, so it was written in the 1500s. And it is truly exquisite. I already know I'm going to rate this 5 stars. This is one of Napoleon's favorite books. I see why. I think it's going to become one of my favorite books too. Apparently when he set out to write this, he really wanted to write something that would rival the Iliad or the Aeneid, and I personally think he's done that so far. In fact, I prefer some of what I've read here to the Iliad and Aeneid. The imagery here is just so beautiful, and sometimes you get the sense with a translated work that there have been some flubs. You know, sometimes you know that the translator took liberties, that you're not really getting the true work in translation. Here, I feel as though I have definitely gotten a very good translation. I'm not quite sure if that's true, but I have just really fallen in love with this, and I think it is just a genuinely beautiful piece of poetry. Again, I do have a bit of a weakness for epic poetry. Just tell me it's epic poetry. I'm kind of into it. I'll probably really enjoy it. But this is one that I think is going to rise quite highly for me. So I do think it's going to become one of my favorite epic poems. Apparently, I did not bring my copy of this down, but I also read My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. I almost don't consider this a classic because it is so modern. And I've always felt like I really struggle with modern classics, so I don't really want to give it that designation. But this was definitely 5 stars. I loved this. Loved this, loved this. This is a bit of a thriller, and I think it's very characteristically Daphne du Maurier. And I honestly don't think knowing where this book ends would make you enjoy it any less. Because the whole root of this story is a mystery that you're still kind of wondering about after finishing it. It is a book that sticks with you because the mystery gets so entrenched in your brain. Throughout the book, you find yourself going back and forth on what you believe is going on whether you believe people are innocent, on whether you believe they're guilty. And even after the book ends, you go back and start second guessing your opinions, which I think is the really brilliant thing about it. I truly loved this. This is definitely now one of my favorite Daphne du Maurier's, but I will always love Frenchman's Creek. I say this every time I talk about Daphne du Maurier, but Frenchman's Creek is one of my favorite books of all time. And I don't think this held a candle to that, but I don't think Frenchman's Creek was trying to do what My Cousin Rachel was trying to do. But this is another really atmospheric read where you definitely see everything that she describes to you. So this is also partially set in Florence, and I just found it so vivid. Again, I would say the way that she describes the heat, and then later how she describes the cold in Cornwall, kind of the wet, damp cold coming in through the walls. But in Florence, it's like a dry, dusty heat that you can't escape from. You're trying to get under awnings of buildings to get away from the sun. It's just really lush. It's just really how it is. The whole book feels oppressive like that. It feels like things are closing in on you. It feels like you're getting a chill up your spine. It's just a really wonderfully done novel, and I highly, highly recommend this one. This is definitely one of my favorite books of the year. Another of my favorite books of the year that I won't spend much time on because I did do an individual review of this is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. No one is more shocked about this than I am, but this book was the easiest 5 stars I've given all year. I knew within the first chapter that I loved this and that I was going to continue to love it. And I'm so pleased to say that I did. Moby Dick is a book that, particularly here in the States, has a very bad connotation, a very poor connotation, because it was often assigned in school. And I was never assigned it in school. I think we'd kind of moved past that because so many people hated it. So many people rebel against Moby Dick because they think it is something that it's not, or they want it to be something that it's not. And I think that can really add to your enjoyment of Moby Dick if you accept early on that what you think Moby Dick is about, you think it is about Moby Dick the whale, you think it is about Captain Ahab and Ishmael. If you accept early on that that's not the main point of the book to Herman Melville, the main point of the book is about whales. It's about whales and the whaling industry and a dying way of life. And once you accept that, I think you're in for a real treat, because then you know what the book is. You don't get so mad at these tangents that he goes off on about whales, about whaling instruments, about how they do kill a whale, the process of killing a whale. I also struggle to recommend this one because so many people hate this, and it's valid. It's totally a valid criticism because either you love these tangents about whales or you hate them. And I personally really loved them, and I enjoyed them more than the actual story. And that's probably contrary to how most readers feel. Most readers are reading for plot and for character. And I would say that normally I read for plot and character too. But here, it didn't really matter to me. The plot and the characters were really, really wonderful. The tangents were also really, really wonderful. And so to me, it married into a perfect book. But I definitely see why over the years so many people have hated it. So many people have hated being assigned it in school. So this is definitely one I hesitate to recommend. I would say take a chance on it. If you think there is a chance that you would like the tangents, please take a chance on it because it is so gorgeously written. He has a real understanding of language, in my opinion, a form of how to just structure a sentence so beautifully. There are lines in this book that have stuck with me that I can still remember pretty much word for word, and I read this a couple of months ago. And so this is definitely a book that is very, very vivid and that has really, really stuck with me. It is probably my favorite book of the year thus far. Next, I read Yevgeny Onyegen by Alexander Pushkin, and this is a Russian classic that is written in verse. So this is a novel that is actually written in verse. So I almost want to call it an epic poem. I almost feel like I can't. There's a lot of attention paid here to characterization in a way that I would say in most epic poems, it's really not. Epic poetry sometimes falls into the realm of archetypes, but this was filled with really well-rounded characters, a really particularly fascinating female character. This was the first Russian classic of many that I would pick up in the past couple of months, and I'm really glad that I decided to kind of start my journey here. This was really, really enjoyable. I don't know what translation I read. That's the only thing about it. I read it on ebook, a free ebook at that. And so I'm not quite sure what translation I got. And part of me really wanted to annotate it. So part of me wishes that I had gotten a physical copy. I have, of course, also been reading the Divine Comedy over the past 3 months. I've been hosting a read-along on my channel, and I have basically burnt out here in Paradiso, and I think most people joining in the read-along have as well, and I really hate that. Paradiso is often the one that I burn out on. I've reread Purgatorio and Inferno many times, but I have never reread Paradiso fully. And I think it's because by the time you get there, you're a little bit tired of the journey. You've been on a long journey with Dante, and Paradiso is a lot to wrap your brain around. And so I feel as though I'm in burnout stage right now. But this is a reread for me. Dante's Divine Comedy is my favorite classic of all time. It's my favorite work of epic poetry, and it's just been a real delight to reread it. I genuinely love Dante, and sometimes when you reread something, I have the fear anyway that it's not going to hold up, that it's not going to be as good as it was the first time. And I always feel that fear with Dante because when I dip in and out of Dante, I rarely read him back to back. I rarely read him cover to cover. I typically kind of zone in on my favorite parts, and I know those hold up, but it's always wondering if the whole is the sum of its parts, and Dante is. Dante's incredible, and the Divine Comedy is just really, really wonderful, and I do highly recommend this, of course. Dante is one of my favorite historical figures, and the Divine Comedy is probably my favorite work of all time. Recently, I read Tartuffe by Moliere, and this is a play. So this is a classic French play from the 1600s, and what a delight this was. I genuinely loved this, and it has really encouraged me. It makes me want to read everything by Moliere. It makes me want to finish this collection of his plays because it was just so much fun. I sometimes struggle with comedy when I am reading a play because I don't think comedy plays well when you are reading it. I think it is something that has to be seen to really get. And so I've often struggled with Shakespeare's comedies, for example, because I think I struggle visualizing it. I think it is something to be seen and not read, but I feel like every bit of the humor here hit for me. I feel like it was really, really funny. I read it with a smile on my face. It was just a really delightful read. And I highly recommend this if you like plays because this was just really short, really fast, really pithy, and it was told in rhyming couplets, which I think added to its charm. I think that made it a really fun, easy read, and it also added to the humor a little bit. This was my first experience with Moliere, and so I'm really excited to see what else he has. I'm really excited to get into his other plays. But speaking of plays, while Tartuffe was definitely a hit, this next one was definitely a miss for me, and that's The Tempest by William Shakespeare. And it hurts me to say this. It really pains me to say this. I'm a basic kind of girl. I love Shakespeare. I love the Renaissance playwrights, and Shakespeare tends to work really well for me. Even in things that I don't like, I tend to say, well, there was something there. In this, I saw nothing. Half the time when I was listening to this, I found myself wondering if Shakespeare even wrote it. It really did not feel very iconically Shakespeare to me at all. Normally you kind of come away from a Shakespeare play with a couple of pithy quotes or something, or even really meaningful, just beautiful turns of phrase. And I came out of The Tempest with absolutely nothing. And I can't even tell you that there were parts of it I enjoyed. Everything about this felt as though it was set up for me to really like, because I really like kind of a magician character because this focus is on Prospero, who is a bit, I would say, almost of a Merlin figure in that you're not quite sure whether or not you can trust him in the beginning. And I really, really struggled with him. I really liked Miranda. I can say that for it. But otherwise, I am left wondering about this. Truly, I really want to do some reading and read up on this and find out if somebody helped him write this, because there are other plays, especially earlier on, in Shakespeare's career that were written by him and somebody else, so they were collaborated on. And often you can see when Shakespeare shines through in those, like the Henry VI plays. You often know when Shakespeare is kind of shining. I just don't think there were many, if any, shining moments in The Tempest. I was just utterly disappointed by this. And conceptually, it seems like it should work so well for me, so I hate that I was so disappointed by it. I gave this 2 stars, and it physically pained me to rate something written by William Shakespeare 2 stars. But this is one that I fully did not get. I'm sad to say that the only Shakespeare that I've read this year was a disappointment to me. Next, I read Ward Number 6, which is just going to stand in for a whole bunch of Anton Chekhov's short stories that I listened to. And I loved this. Loved this. I feel like Ward Number 6 is the only short story that I can say something about without completely spoiling it. But it focuses on a doctor who works at an asylum. And he starts a sort of friendship with one of the patients who he doesn't really believe is all that insane. He doesn't seem unstable. And so he forms a connection with him and they have a really interesting conversation. And things do kick off from there. But that was such a wild story. I mean, it was just a really, really wonderful reading experience. I have never read Anton Chekhov's plays. I started with these short stories and I am so glad that I did. This is another example of something short that I read this year that I don't think needed to be any longer. I think it was perfect the way that it was. I definitely think Ward Number 6 was longer than the other short stories that I read in this collection. So it might have been a novella, but it was told so brilliantly and the suspense, it was really, really intense. So this was definitely a success. I rated this 4 stars. And I also listened to First Love by Ivan Turgenev, and I almost want to give this 5 stars, but I'm only going to give it 4. I loved this. This was also a novella and a Russian classic, and this is so good. If you have not read this, please pick this up. It is so good. It's really, really short. It's really engaging, but I don't think you know where this story is going. You believe you know where it's going, but you don't. Trust me. It is so good. Of everything Russian that I have read recently, this is probably the most exciting one to me because I had a good feeling about some of these classics. This one I took a chance on completely, and I am so glad I did. It has really pumped me up about Turgenev in general and makes me really, really want to pick up something else by him. It is really, really short, but that means no time is wasted. So it's just a really wonderful, very, very tightly written novella. So this is one I highly recommend, very high 4 stars. I also read The Secret History by Procopius, and I have to say largely since finishing this, I've pretty much forgotten about it. It's also very short, and I would say that's not necessarily a mark against it, but what is that this edition to me feels extremely sparse. It feels like it should have far more notes than it does because he often makes references to things that he feels like he's told you in another book, but you as the reader have not read his other writing, presumably. So I think that Penguin should have put in some explanations for those things. That's my opinion anyway. But this is a classic of the Byzantine Empire. It was written in the 500s, and it is a very gossipy account of court life in the reign of the Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora. And I am genuinely fascinated by Theodora. So Theodora is one of my favorite historical figures of all time. And I was really interested to read a contemporary picture of her. Procopius does not really paint a favorable picture of her, but then he doesn't really paint a favorable picture of anyone. And so that's kind of the mystery around this, is that you're not quite sure whether Procopius wrote this as a joke or not, or if maybe this is how he really felt and he didn't feel as though he could say it publicly. This is definitely a very interesting classic, but I don't think it's where you can begin your journey with the Byzantine Empire at all. I found myself wishing while reading this that I was reading a contemporary nonfiction alongside it, because I did feel as though it really needed some extra information, some extra explanation of some of the things he was referencing. I also read A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov. Wow, I also really loved this. I also listened to this on audiobook. I've been apparently really enjoying Russian classics on audiobook, but this is kind of a work of romanticism in Russia, and it focuses on a really Byronic hero, and it's written in the form of a diary entry a bit, and so it's kind of written as though somebody discovered this man's diary. And I think that format really works well for it. I didn't really like him as a character, and in fact, the characters and the plot didn't mean nearly as much to me as his description of nature. So our main character is a soldier who is stationed in the Caucasus, and the descriptions of the mountains there, it was just beautiful. Just the descriptions of things that he saw off in the distance as they were walking. It was a really, really lushly written novel, and it did feel very romantic because there was such emphasis on nature, on setting. I read this immediately on the heels of First Love, and so I do think it fell a little bit because I really liked Ivan Turgenev's writing. And again, because I listened to this stuff on audiobook, I'm not quite sure who the translators were. Sometimes the audiobook narrator would say this was translated by someone, but often they did not. And so maybe I got a really good translation of First Love and a not so good translation of A Hero of Our Time, but I did really, really enjoy A Hero of Our Time. And last but not least, in terms of my recent Russian obsession, I have recently finished The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was 5 stars. I loved this. This has really spiraled me down a deep, dark Dostoevsky hole. I now want to read everything that Dostoevsky wrote, and I really want to immediately start something else by him. As soon as I finished this, I felt the impulse to read something else by him. And so I'm so glad I decided to start my journey with Dostoevsky here, because this is a really, really charming novel that also has elements of a thriller to it that make you really, really want to keep reading. There's almost a semi-mystery element to some of this because some of the characters do things that make zero sense to you or to the other characters. And so you spend a lot of the narrative trying to figure out what their next move is going to be. What are they going to do next, and whether you should be worried about it. And so there's a really compelling side to this that makes you want to keep turning the page. But I think also you were just really, really in love with the characters here, and you were particularly in love with the main character, Prince Myshkin. And so this was just a really wonderful reading experience. And I constantly was thinking throughout this that a book that I'm currently reading that I'm not going to wrap up here is War and Peace. And on the back of War and Peace, there is a quote at the top that says, "If life could write, it would write like Tolstoy." And throughout the process of reading this, I said, how can someone have said that? How can someone have said that when Dostoevsky was right there? I think if life could write, it would write like Dostoevsky. So hopefully this is a very, very good indication of my journey with this classic Russian author. But those are all of the classics that I have finished so far this year. I've definitely DNF'd a lot, and there are plenty of books that I am still currently in the middle of that I will wrap up at the end of the year. That's very crazy to think about. I would love to know your opinion on these if you have read them, if any of them are on your TBR. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.